Par Filippo Ferrario, Characterization of the seafloor for benthic ecology. What does it mean for benthic ecologists?
Merci. Ma présentation va être en anglais, mais je peux prendre les questions en français après. Non, ça, c'est pas le debout. Je vais à l'arrière. Okay. Regardez pas. Okay. So today, what I would like to talk to you about is what it means for a benthic ecologist like me to characterize the seafloor in terms of what we can do in benthic ecology research. Okay. So first of all, what is benthos? Benthos is the community of organisms that lives on or near the bottom, in this case the seafloor. And as Louis David showed before, we are working mainly in coastal areas, so in an area that is basically between, let's say, 0 and 20 meters, more or less. Here, the bottom is usually heterogeneous. So as you can see, you have areas where you have sandy bottom mixed with different type of rocks of different sizes, so from cobbles to boulders. And this is important for us because species associate with a certain type of bottom type. As you can see, another things that can change is the spatial distribution of the different type of substrate. In this picture, for example, you can see a sandy floor with boulders that are actually covered with macroalgae. And once we have characterized the type of seabed, the other thing we need to know usually is what type of vegetation we have. So the different species of algae, because they contribute to create habitat and they also provide food for animal species. Once we have characterized that, then we can also focus on the different animals. In particular, in our group at DFO, we work with invertebrates mainly, crustaceans as lobsters and crabs, echinoderms such as sea urchins, some fish also, and some bivalves and mollusks, sorry. What we do, part of the work we do is trying to understand how species are distributed and also how they use their habitat. And to do that, usually what you do is try to establish relationship between the density or the movement of these species with properties and characteristics of the habitat. It might be environmental characteristic as the temperature, but also as the physical characteristics such as the bottom type or the presence of vegetation on the seafloor. So basically, these two, the last two aspects are mainly a spatial issue. So we need to have maps, and we have to take into account that the different animals have different capabilities in terms of movement, so there will be some that move really slow or over short distances, and some species that move potentially over large scales. So that means that we need to adapt our maps, or we need maps of different scales to match the movement. The problem for us is that as soon as we start increasing the size and the scale of the map that we have, that we need, we kind of lose in terms of detail and resolution of the map. So that the highest amount of information and the maximum resolution we can have is when we work at a small scale, well, actually a diver can, well, anyway, divers can go on the site and measure properties of the seafloor or the benthic community. And also, sometimes we don't even have maps, so it becomes tricky. For example, in this study that has been done in my group recently, they were trying to understand how lobsters were moving in relationship to a site that had a fish farm. Here, all the lines you can see are the tracks of movement of different lobsters. And here, the habitat type was basically just inside or outside the fish farm. And it would have been nicer to have something more like a multi-beam survey that could have given us the depth or the slope. And what we'd really like to have is the substrate classification. CIDCO has also collaborated with us in another site to try to do this kind of mapping. And we can see that there is still some work to be done in terms of translating the multi-beam survey into a bottom classification. So this is something that we are looking forward in terms of possible results from this type of work. At small scales, we try to understand how the species use their habitat. And here, for example, some of the work we are doing is trying to understand how the sea urchins are moving in an heterogeneous type of habitat. Here in this image, you can imagine the gray squares as the rocky part of the bottom. The yellow can be sandy areas, and then you have boulders and other type of rocks that can increase the heterogeneity locally. A way to study this topic is to use a spatial point pattern analysis, where basically you use the distribution of individuals as a proxy for movement. So in a picture like this, you can imagine that you want to turn every person to a point and map the area where these people were in the picture. And you would like to find relationship between where the density of points were the highest with the properties and the things that were in that environment. Another technique that we can use is acoustic telemetry, not with people, but with animals in the seafloor, yes. And with acoustic telemetry, we are able to track individual animals that move on the seafloor. And in this case, we then try to match or at least establish a relationship between where the animal went, how much time they spent in a certain place, with what was available in that area. So in both cases, anyway, we need maps to then do our statistical modeling. And at the small scales, what we are using now is photomosaics created by photogrammetry. Divers are actually diving on the study site, collecting pictures that then are stitched together, and we also have a 3D model of the bottom. These photomosaics are, you know what they are. They are basically kind of aerial pictures of the bottom that can cover a large part of the bottom compared to what you can have by a single picture. And they're really rich in data. So here, for example, each red dot is a sea urchin. You can have also someone to digitize where the rock were, and similarly the type of algae and where these algae were. So once you have the data in this way, you then can calculate other variables such as the distance between features in the landscape, or you can try to summarize what was in the surrounding of a certain point using different buffers. So just to give you an example, these two images are a map of a given transect that we did, and each pixel is having the information of the number of rock patches that were at around 50 centimeters from the point in the top image, or in the 2 meter around the point in the bottom image. So you can have, because you have the data in that way, then you can try to work at different scales even within a given mosaic. And finally, we'd like also to characterize the presence of other species or other small features, such as the presence of dead shells and other small substrate that can play a role in how the species move and utilize their habitat. Finally, you need to put those information in relationship with, for example, the densities of your species of interest so that you can build a statistical model. In terms of what we are doing with acoustic telemetry, we are trying to couple the information we can get from the photomosaics to the movement of the species. Here is a photomosaic we did in Godbout here in the St. Lawrence. Is an area of 60 meter by 60 meter where we also had an acoustic telemetry array that will give us the movement of different urchins. And from these mosaics, we were also able to get a pretty nice 3D model. So we have a digital elevation model for that site that from which we hope that we can have information about the spatial complexity. Problem is that once we have the mosaics, before we are able to do our fancy analysis and publish the nice paper we want, we need to extract the data from the images so that we can actually work with them. And basically, we need to transform the image into a map. What we do, the approach we use is kind of a GIS approach, where we have different layers for different type of information. So a layer for species and another layer for substrate and macroalgae, for example, so that we then can calculate our matrices. The data extraction so far has been done manually in a GIS environment, where we used polygons, for example, for things like rocks or macroalgae, but it's really a long process to digitize the rocks, and is also subject to some subjectivity, because then you need to decide which rock you want to digitize and which not. For animals, we mainly use points so far. So we have the position of the animals, but not much more than that. And we do recognize that animals are not points, but are more like polygons. So this is what we would like to use in the future, because if we have polygons, then we can have other information about the animals, such as the size, or even trying to understand the behavior from the shape of the animal. We are trying to move towards an automatized approach. We have been doing some tests, and we had someone helping us doing pixel classification on our mosaics to have the layer of the bottom type. They use PCI geomatic, I think, and you can see from this image that in this way we can have really nice polygons for the different classes of substrate, more than what we can do manually, clearly. And we are collaborating with CIDCO to try to use machine learning to annotate the presence of the different invertebrates in our photomosaics. Here is an example of the work CIDCO has done to identify sea urchins in our photomosaic, and you can speak with Guillaume Morissette. He's pretty happy about the results of his machine learning process. So from these two approaches, we are now trying to think of a framework where we can have one or more machine learning algorithms that can give us information for the species and for the substrate in that layered structure that we want, because it's the way we then need to analyze the data. And finally, with that kind of approach, what we would like to avoid is this kind of Swiss cheese effect, in the sense that if we have polygons describing the species that are on the bottom, what we would like is to have a layer just for the bottom and a layer just for the species, to avoid that where the species is present is kind of creating a hole in the part of the map that represent the seafloor. Ideally, we would like also to combine the 3D structure we have, the 3D information we have with the 2D information, because in that way we could be able to, for example, remove that part of three-dimensionality due to animal species or algal species, so that we can have just the rugosity or the three-dimensionality that is pertaining just the substrate. So in the end, what we need is the possibility to have map at different scales. Working at medium scales already will be a plus for us if we can have multi-beam surveys able to classify the substrate for us. And then when we work at small scale instead, we'd like to try to have a nice workflow for data extraction, because that will speed up increasingly the ability that we have. I mean, the data extraction process for us, and so we can analyze our data faster. So now I'm turning to you because you are the expert, and so I would like any thought on how we can do this better, so that we avoid to drown as the little kid here in this picture. With this, I'm done with this presentation. I would like to be contacted by you if you have an idea or suggestions. So here are some of our contacts. I'm working with Yannick Gendreau, that is here today, and Christopher McKenzie at the Institut Maurice Lamontagne here in Montjoly. And so again, what we need is to classify and characterize the bottom at small and medium scale, mainly. And I'll be happy to take any question if you have.
Merci beaucoup. Avez-vous des questions ou des idées pour l'aider?
$5 each idea.
Moi, j'ai peut-être une idée. Côté backscatter, donc rétrodiffusion, le service hydrographique a vraiment une tonne de données qui n'est pas vraiment exploitée. Est-ce que vous regardez ça? Donc, l'utilisation du backscatter pour classifier les fonds, c'est utilisé un peu partout dans le monde comme méthode.
Okay. Pas nous, parce que moi je suis un écologiste, donc j'aurais aucune idée de comment le faire. Mais je pense des gens comme à CIDCO ou peut-être les gens de services hydrographiques pourraient, si nous, il faudrait qu'on parle avec eux pour voir s'ils sont capables de... C'est plus vous qui vous devez dire si vous êtes capable de nous donner cette information-là. Donc, ça se peut,
la donnée de base est là. Ensuite, pour la traiter, c'est plus compliqué, mais ça peut se faire. Là.
OK. Donc, on fait un relevé multibeam et puis on est capable de savoir si c'était de la roche ou c'était de la sable.
Oui, mais l'avantage, c'est qu'il y a déjà énormément de données qui existent déjà, qui ont été réalisées, entre autres dans l'estuaire. Presque tout l'estuaire est cartographié avec le multibeam. Il y a une partie de cette donnée-là de rétrodiffusion qui est déjà disponible. Là.
OK.
Donc, il y a du travail à faire avec le service hydrographique, puis avec des géologues comme moi, par exemple.
OK, c'est bon à savoir.
Oui.
Merci Filippo pour ta présentation. Quelle est la zone dans laquelle vous travaillez en termes de profondeur? Vous allez jusqu'à combien de mètres à peu près?
Donc,
moins profond, plus profond.
Dernièrement, on travaille plus sur des profondeurs entre 10 mètres et 15-20 mètres. Je dirais 10 à 15. Surtout parce qu'on travaille souvent avec les algues, donc il faut considérer la capacité de la lumière de pénétrer et la distribution des algues. Et ici, surtout, c'est beaucoup limité à ces profondeurs-là. On pourrait aller plus profond, ça va impliquer au niveau des logistiques plus complexes, au niveau de la plongée. Ça serait possible, ou utiliser des autres instruments comme des ROV, mais on a encore pas beaucoup d'expérience sur ça.
Est-ce que vous allez moins profond aussi dans la zone des 5 mètres, mettons, voire moins?
On pourrait. Pour le moment, surtout quand on utilise la télémétrie, on a des sites qui sont, une fois qu'ils sont ajustés pour la marée, sont autour de 5 mètres, quelque chose comme ça. Moins profond que ça. Si on utilise de la télémétrie, ça se peut qu'il soit un problème pour la télémétrie, donc pour la méthode de la télémétrie. Donc, ça dépend un peu du type d'études qu'on fait. Mais si on fait seulement comme de la Special Point Pattern Analysis, ça se peut aller moins profond qui 5 mètres en théorie.
Parfait, donc merci beaucoup. Donc on va passer à la dernière présentation de cette première session. Oui, allez-y.
Oui, bonjour. En fait, c'est pour revenir à ce que vous avez posé comme question par rapport au backscatter. Je fais partie de l'équipe qui génère les NONA pour le service hydrographique. Et puis, la prochaine étape qu'on tente de faire cette année, c'est de rajouter nos images de rétrodiffusion sur le site de NONA. Fait que donc, on espère que dans les prochains mois, vous allez pouvoir accéder à ces données. Fait que si vous avez des questions, commentaires, s'il vous plaît, faites-nous en part parce qu'on ne sait pas trop qu'est-ce que le monde veut, parce qu'on pose des questions à 5 personnes, on a 5 réponses différentes. Donc, n'hésitez pas, s'il vous plaît, à nous approcher ou à m'en parler aujourd'hui. Même chose pour les NONA, si vous avez des questions, commentaires, n'hésitez pas.
Super, un gros merci.
Je viens prendre un café avec toi après.